Hi everyone, and welcome to Making Virtual Meetings Matter. This is a taster webinar taken from our masterclass workshop on Making Meetings Matter, part of our Management Mastery Suite. I'm Clinton Wingrove. I'm delighted to join you today. I started my career way back in the 70s, and ever since that early days, I've been passionate about the issues of how do we increase productivity and overall performance, and how do we help people accelerate their development. And through a variety of careers in consultancy, in systems, computer systems and process design, being a CEO of an HR software house and consultancy, I've continued to experience that passion. But one of the things I've noticed is, if we go back to the 70s, meeting rooms were dusty places where you found curled up papers left in the corner. They were infrequently used. But as we moved into the 70s and huge work was being done on involvement of people, collective bargaining, a whole variety of things, then we moved on to the quality era, where we engaged in brainstorming and team activities. And then we moved into an era where performance management became rife, and we saw processes like force ranking, etc., where people started to see performance management as something where they were caught out if they'd not done well, rather than something where success was celebrated. We saw groups of people coming together more frequently, and we entered an era in the 80s, which has spanned right through to the present day, where as one senior executive in California, a client of mine, said, we've entered the period where we have the scourge of meetings. And that's no different now. Recent research projects, and a number of them have been published, have shown that middle managers often spend something in the order of 35% of their time in meetings. And with the COVID pandemic, that has increased dramatically. Senior managers and executives were found to spend 50% or more of their time, and that has also escalated. And late last year, a study revealed that there are 25 million meetings in the USA alone per day. And when executives were reviewed on how effective they believe they were, they estimated that at least 1 in 4 meetings were complete failures. They actually added nothing, if not very little, to the success of their organizations. So we've been spending a lot of time looking at how do we address that, and there's a variety of things clearly we can do. What I want to share with you today is highlights from three areas. One is, why are meetings different? And of course, we've seen this dramatic shift from face-to-face into virtual. Some of you who attended one of our earlier webinars on going virtual with training, and also one on virtual professionalism, will know we touched on it then. We're going to come back to that and just do some summary. Want to look at the importance of planning. I'm sure we all remember that cliche that failure to plan is planning to fail. But meetings epitomize that. The number of times I see in organizations, and it's even more so now, they are so easy. We just send a Zoom link or a Teams link. What I've seen so often is people saying, well, let's have a meeting on that. And again, I want to look at what should we be considering when we're planning. And then lastly is the issue of management. And you don't have to be the chairperson to affect management within a meeting. But what we do know is large percentages of meetings are spent addressing sidebar issues, going off on tangents, bringing people up to date who should have been prepared before they even arrived. So I want to go through those three things. So let's go back, first of all, to why they're different. And there's a whole variety of reasons why virtual meetings are different to face-to-face meetings. Many of the things we'll be covering today apply equally to face-to-face meetings. So even if we return to some new normal, even if it looks similar to our current situation, what we'll be sharing is still applicable. And just as a sidebar on that point, I've got a number of clients who are now saying, we've found that we can work virtually. Why would we return to face-to-face environments? We can reduce our capital assets in property. We can make better use of the space. So there's clearly an issue around this. But let's go back to virtual meetings. How are they different? Firstly, they're different because of the cognitive disconnect. When you have face-to-face meetings, you arrive, you rub shoulders with each other, you have informal chats before you take your seat. There's often coffee involved or some form of beverage. And what happens is you get the measure of each other. You spot and detect the mood of the meeting. You sense the positions of the people. Frequently, you can use that time to encourage or nudge, as one of the new influencing techniques is known. You share information. You say, by the way, when we get to item 3, don't forget to mention X or whatever. All of that is gone on a virtual meeting. Typically, you arrive. You may have some idle banter, but it's now shared with everybody. There's not that opportunity for a couple of people to stand in the corner. You don't have that connection. And typically at the end, when you click close or leave meeting, that's it, you're gone. Whereas we now know that from studying the comparisons, that in physical meetings, at the end, people typically patted each other on the shoulder, commented on their contributions in the meeting. And again, additional data was shared as they left the room. Peter, glad you picked up that project. By the way, if you need any help, give me a shout. Those things don't happen now in virtual meetings. So we've got a loss of information and a loss of that contact. And going with that, we've lost emotional connection as well. We now know that with the video being compressed, very often quite small, you're probably viewing me, if you're viewing me on a reasonable size screen, you're probably seeing me about an inch square. That's significantly smaller than I am. I wish weight loss was that easy as the video size is. But on a serious note, we now know with the compression of the video and the size of the screen, we are losing those emotional triggers, those things which our unconscious brain interprets and helps us to sense the mood, to develop the relationship. And it's not been proven yet scientifically, I don't believe, but there is anecdotal evidence and certainly strong suspicion that this explains why in a virtual world it's much easier for people to make quite serious, even abusive, negative and adverse comments. And then we've got the distractions. I did some research into meetings and found that in physical meetings, at any instant in time, if you bang the table and ask people to write down exactly what was just said, about 50% of the people in a physical meeting can do so. And why is that? Well, the reason is that we have an unconscious brain which can cater for about 11 million bits of information a second. Our conscious brain can only handle about 120. And as a consequence, that unconscious brain frequently takes us off on a tangent. So even if we're physically sitting in a meeting, we're making a note on our pad. We're quickly checking our email, our smartphone pings. We remember that on the way home, we've got to pick up some shopping for our partner. We recall that we forgot to do something on our way into work. We're thinking about the next question we're going to ask. There can be thousands of distractions. Now, add to that in a virtual world, you've probably got the neighbor's dog barking, you're working from your lounge and your partner's working from the kitchen. So we have a lot more distractions going on. And that leads to the two issues of attention. One is the attention level, which I just described. We now know that in virtual meetings, that 50% actually drops to 33% or just over. So consequently, if you are making a presentation in a virtual meeting, there's a 1 in 3 chance that the person you're trying to influence is actually listening to you. That poses a serious problem for meetings. Yeah. And in terms of attention spans, we now know that in a virtual world, attention spans are round about 10 seconds. In other words, if you're not stimulated audibly or visually, or by your own unconscious thoughts, or even your conscious thoughts, if you're not stimulated every 10 seconds, those distractions are going to kick in. By the way, goldfish have an attention span of about 12 seconds, but then there's less to distract goldfish. The last thing is they are just too easy. Yeah. And as a consequence, we have too many of them. What organizations I'm speaking to are confirming that they are seeing more and more and more meetings, more and more multiple person meetings. Now, there's absolutely no problem in having lots of contact with people. I'd strongly recommend, and in fact, we ran a webinar on working virtually for managers. And we said you need to contact your staff very frequently to keep in touch. But that should be on a more one-to-one basis. But what we're seeing is an explosion in one-to-many meetings where many, many people are actively engaged. Why? Because we can. We can send out a Zoom meeting. We can send out, a Teams meeting, or whichever platform you may use, Blue Jeans, etc. So what we need to think about then is how are we going to address those things? I said we'd look at things that apply to all meetings. So I now want to move on and talk about what we should consider when we're planning meetings. Now, if you've got the luxury of having enough time to spend all of your day in meetings, some of this won't apply. But my guess is if you're working for an organization today, the probability is your organization is seriously concerned about productivity, seriously concerned about rebuilding its liquid assets, its cash base, seriously concerned about getting more done with less time. And as a consequence, I'd suggest reflecting on that. What we're going to share, most of this will apply to physical meetings as well as virtual. But as we go through, I'll highlight where virtual has some differences. The first one is thinking around what is the purpose. And I'm not going to cover here today things like team building meetings, weekend, end of week quizzes, perhaps the formal agile scrum type meetings. What I'm talking about here is all of those meetings which are directly related to the operation, getting work done. So operational meetings, management meetings, project meetings. And as a consequence, there should always be a purpose, and that purpose should be clearly defined in output terms. And I frequently see agendas put together where the purpose has been described as to get together to catch up. Getting together to catch up through a virtual meeting is a relatively inefficient and it's a highly ineffective way of doing things for most groups of people for the reasons I've just described. So first of all, what's the purpose of your meeting? Why are you getting groups of people together? What is the clearly defined outcome you're looking for them to achieve? Having looked at what that purpose is, then it's easier to answer the question, is this better achieved by bringing these people together synchronously, which is what a meeting is? Or would we be better off, given technology that's available now, to bring these people together asynchronously, which means they can each decide how much time they invest, and they can each decide when, in fact, they actually do that. So as an example, if you want people to be brought up to date on the state of a project so that they can make a decision as to when to trigger the next phase, bringing them together to be brought up to date is probably a poor use of time. Share the material, share the information asynchronously. You can do that using file sharing. If you want them to see a presentation, record the presentation and put it somewhere where they can watch it in their own timeline. We've got to get used to making much better use of that type of technology, forcing people all to come together at the same time, all to listen to the same presentation, when we know that only about a third of it will they actually catch, does not make sense. So share the information in advance, allow them asynchronously to catch up. Now bring them together with the specific objective. Now, having caught up, let's make the decision on whether we go with phase 2, which may require debate, etc., and therefore is a legitimate use of time. And I see many, many examples where out of an hour, 45 minutes will be spent on a presentation. And I always remember that wonderful phrase from video arts: the brain can only absorb what the butt can endure. And so 45 minutes is spent sitting, listening to a droning presentation. And then only 15 minutes is left for the actual meaty, serious part, which requires people to interact, which is the decision making. So think about what's your purpose. The second thing then is, who are the attendees? One of the things that I do as well is I do a lot of work equipping people with high-level decision-making skills. And one of the things that we look at there, we cover problem solving and decision typically. What we look at is how you create a matrix of the people that you might involve. And we should always be doing the same thing with meetings. We have a tendency to involve people in case they're going to be upset. Let me tell you now, most people who don't get invited to meetings are absolutely delighted. We seem to have this strange belief that if we don't invite people, they're going to be upset. We should be thinking instead from a purpose of what their interest is and what their contribution could be. So thinking about that, think about the people that you could be involving. What's the extent to which they can influence or contribute to the decision? In other words, what's their input level likely to be? We should only be inviting people who can contribute. That's why we want them to attend. This is not a road show. This is an operational meeting. We're looking for make optimum use of resources. The second factor to consider is the level of interest they have. It's no good bringing people who may have the skills to contribute to the discussion if they have no interest in the topic. Why? Because they will fall in the 2/3 category who are not paying attention and therefore not really contributing. So map your people, and the people you're looking for to involve in a meeting are those who are interested in the topic, and those who are also able to influence, contribute, and make reasonable quality decisions that will be required of that meeting. The question then, of course, is, and how much of the meeting do they need to attend? One of the beauties of virtual meetings, and this is a real asset over and above physical meetings, is so much easier to have people drop in and drop out. Now, my concern is I see people drop in and drop out who actually should be at the meeting all of the time. But when you're planning a meeting, think seriously. You can now ask people to drop in at 11:15 for 15 minutes. They haven't got to walk the length of a corridor, get between two buildings, or get on a train or a plane to get there. We can bring people in from around the globe instantly. So think very carefully about attendance. Who are the people that you need? Who are the people that are interested? And how long do you need them for? That starts to take you then into thinking about the issue of duration, because if you're thinking about when you're going to have people here, you've got to start thinking about the time. And ironically, this is one thing where I find most meetings go in the other way. And that is, we seriously underestimate how much time we need. When I was doing some research, which was looking at a combination of things, it was looking at a combination of the attention that people pay when they're in meetings and the quality of decisions, which I've just mentioned are two of things I'm quite passionate about. What I discovered is our worst decisions are typically made at 2 points during meetings. One is right at the beginning. Why? Because at the beginning of most meetings, people rush in. People are typically late. I'm experiencing, again, in the research I'm doing, approximately 4/5 of people are late to meetings. Now, let's put aside the dramatic impact that the disrespect that shows has. what we know is if they're rushing in, joining a little late and coming straight into a meeting that is already into discussion, the quality of their contribution will actually be poor. The second time when meetings make really poor decisions is towards the end. And this is even exacerbated in virtual meetings, because towards the end, people are starting to think about where are they going next? What meeting are they on next? Because now what we're seeing is a plethora of back-to-back meetings. I've got a meeting from 10 till 11. I've got a meeting from 11 till 12. I've got a lunch break from 12 till 12:30. I've got a meeting at 12:30 till 2, 2 till 3. We're seeing this increasingly. Why? Because it's easy, because we can. And we have access to people's calendars now. It's possible to calendarize. So what we do is we work out, do we need a 1-hour meeting, 2-hour meeting, or 3-hour meeting? And I'll come back to that in a second. And then we plop it in their calendar. What we don't do is plop in their calendar the time that they need to prepare for the next meeting and the time they need to wrap up and make notes from the one they've just been in. So we actually force these bad decisions into those parts of the meetings. The other thing is most of us suffer from an unconscious bias called optimism bias or overconfidence bias. It's what explains why all projects typically overrun both on time and on budget. And we know that because of the ones in the press, like new rail systems, new buildings, new roads, etc. But it applies right down to everything. It applies right down to how quickly you tell your partner you can change the washer in the faucet or the tap in the kitchen. We have an overconfidence bias. We always believe in our own ability to do things. If things go well, we credit our own ability with why it's gone well. If things go wrong, we typically look for reasons and excuses which are beyond us. So when you're thinking about the duration of a meeting, you should be seriously thinking about how long will it actually take. And if you think something's going to take an hour, you should probably allow an hour and 15 minutes at least. The other thing is we should not start from the perspective of meetings run for an hour, 2 hours, or 3 hours. If we want to ensure that we have people's attention, actually starting them not on the hour and finishing them not on the hour is probably a good decision. And in fact, there's one client I had in the US where they had their calendar system modified so that you couldn't schedule meetings to start and finish on the hour. And what that did was it made people think, and it also forced people typically to have 15 minutes break here and there between meetings. And that takes us then to further preparation that's needed. And that is, what preparation do you want the attendees to make? And I'm appalled at how often I see people arriving at meetings, having been sent briefing papers, etc., and not being adequately prepared. The only thing I see people preparing is PowerPoint slides, most of which should actually be discarded. And if any of you are interested, this is an area that I work in, but there's a fabulous video out on YouTube by DJ Phillips on how to fix PowerPoints. But thinking about preparation, if we want meetings to be effective, if we want meetings to be things that people enjoy going to, believe that they add value and take minimal time, we need to think about the preparation that each attendee needs to make. And that means in planning a meeting, we should prepare and work out what that is. We should advise them. What is the material that they need to read? What research, if any, should they be doing? What positions should they be adopting? So if we're looking to make a decision, do they have a view? And if so, how can they justify that view? How can they rationalize it? And we should be communicating that clearly to people with adequate time for them to do it. Why not? Have you noticed that when you go to the dentist, before you sit in the chair, all of the tools that they're going to need for your particular appointment are ready? Very often we don't notice these things, but that's what makes them professional. Can you imagine going in for surgery and the surgeon starts thinking about preparation when you're actually coming through the door on the trolley? Yeah, We should take meetings as seriously as this. If you're attending a meeting with 6 people in it, I want you to write down on a piece of paper how much you think that meeting is going to cost per hour. When you start to think of that, it has a dramatic difference. When I was working many years ago with 3M, we used to write on a flip chart how much this meeting is going to cost us per hour. We took the average salaries of the people attending. We added 20% to allow for overheads, etc. And then we added another 50% to allow for the facilities and the room and the cost of lighting, etc. And so on. Add that up and start thinking about it. It says preparation matters. So think about what is the preparation people need to make. Yeah, and make sure that you make that clear. Now, in virtual meetings, again, it's even more appropriate. In physical meetings, it's so much easier to quickly share things across the table. And I've heard people say, oh, no, with modern technology, with Teams and Zoom and so on, we can share documents very easy on a screen. Absolutely, you can on a screen. But how legible are they going to be? How distracted are people going to be if they have to keep switching between applications on their screen? I want people to be prepared when they come into the meeting so that they can give attention to the discussion, which is why we're having a meeting. We're having a meeting for them to interact. So make sure that you send that out. Make sure you remind people. And when I say send it out, the virtual world now allows you again to do this asynchronously. Make sure if people need to know something, yeah, and if you can communicate that through a document, through a slide deck, etc., make it available to them in advance and remind them a couple of times to make sure that they look at it before they arrive. And in particular, point out to them why you want them to read it. What is it you are expecting them to look for? And that then takes us to the agenda. And in the agenda, many people provide very, very simple agendas. What you'll notice here is a much more detailed and a structured agenda. And this is one I would say is fairly typical that I would expect to see for a meeting that is going to be extremely well run. What I want to go through is what are the sorts of things you should be including in the agenda? And you say, well, surely I've just got to tell people to turn up, the prep they need, and the time to arrive. Yeah, and in simple terms, that may be a fair comment. But what I want to have a look at here is a whole variety of things. And in fact, we'll be sharing the slide deck with you so that you can actually see this at your leisure. And it's animated for you, which Webinar Jam doesn't support. So the first one is the purpose. Again, a summary of the purpose, but remind people, why are we getting together? We're not getting together for a social chat. We're not getting together for an hour. We're getting together to do something. So I've just put a simple example here to finalize the rollout plan for phase 2. So this is a project meeting. It's project on time, and we're meeting for that purpose. Logistics. What are the logistics? Always declare date, time, preferably time zone if you have multi-international attendees, and tell people when to log in and when the meeting will close. Do not tell people when the meeting will start. If you tell people that the meeting will start at 9 o'clock, that's what goes in the calendar. You tell them to log in 15 minutes earlier. They hope to remember that. They never do, so consequently they arrive late. So you should declare login time and close time. Give them the meeting logistics. If you need to keep that separate and confidential, that may go out separately in a secure encrypted email, or you can include it in your email document if that's going via your agenda document, if that's going via email as well. And then the other thing is, if this meeting is a serious meeting, if this meeting is something where you definitely need these people to be there and to be on board, I would also suggest you have a backup channel. So this morning I was on a meeting. It was a project review of a sales activity. There were 13 people on, which is more than I would typically recommend for a virtual meeting anyway, but we had 13 people on. We were all on a platform which we were using, but we had a shared backup means of communicating. So if that platform locked, if our internet went down, we all had an alternative means through our cell phones, through a second internet line or whatever. If a meeting is critically important, don't expose yourself to risks on the logistics. In terms of attendees then, don't just tell people that you want them to attend, tell them what the role you want them to fulfill is. And again, this is just an example. So we've got the initials of the people attending. We've defined who's going to be chairing the meeting. We've defined the agenda owners. Each item on an agenda, there's an owner for. Why? Because that should have its own output. So each item has got an agenda owner. In some cases, you may want to have a facilitator. If you've got a meeting with 6 or more people, I strongly recommend you consider having someone, and it can be one of those people, given the role of facilitating. In other words, stepping in and making sure that those who suck the air from the room are controlled to some extent, and those who are not making the contribution for which they were expected are actually brought into the conversation. And if you're doing things like brainstorming, nominal group technique, 5 whys, any of those decision-making processes, they typically work better with a facilitator. Also have someone responsible for timing. Meetings overrun because the delegates at the meeting don't take notice of the time. Make that a specific responsibility. And again, it can be one of the people who's also participating. And then lastly, how are you reporting out? And I find a lot of people saying, well, with the current things, what we can do is get people to put their main points in the chat and we'll save the chat and that will be our record. That is one of the most inefficient means of recording stuff. Yes, it's easy to find stuff, but it still takes time. So there is still a place for having some form of documentation. If the meeting is relatively simple and you simply are recording a decision, then minutes might be appropriate. Just record the decision. But I work a lot with consultants and professional managers, and frequently you want a record of what was discussed, why, what opportunities were reviewed and rejected. If you're in an operational meeting and your output is going to go up to senior management for approval, senior managers are not going to sign off just because you've persuaded them there is a rationale for what you've considered. They also want to know what you considered and rejected and why you rejected it. They'll also want to know, did you do a risk assessment on the recommendation you're making? So that will often require more documentation than actually a typical minute would require. So give some thought to how are you going to make sure that that's recorded. And then on the individual items themselves, the agenda items themselves, sorry, I jumped preparation. Record in there again, the preparation. Where are the documents? Where is the material that people need so that they can do the preparation that's required? And then on the individual agenda items themselves, one of the beauties of working virtually is you can have timers and clocks and traffic lights. There's all sorts of apps that you can now use. So you can, in fact, manage the time of meetings much, much more efficiently than typically we did in face-to-face meetings. So on the issue of timing, always have a time allocated at the beginning to log in. This reinforces the point again. Yeah, the meeting starts when people are logged in. That means there has to be a login period. And again, look at how frequently are people arriving on time and how late are they arriving if they arrive late. Plan your meeting accordingly. And then during that time, we'll cover this later when I talk about management of meetings. You also need to make sure that when people log in, you keep their attention. Because it's very easy for people to log in, go on mute, and then they start doing something and they still arrive late. Why? Because they forget to come off mute. So think about that. And then time for each item. If an item should be on the agenda, it should be allocated the time that it requires. That should not be eroded by items that happen to be ahead of it in the agenda. If an item's time can be eroded, don't allocate that time to it in the first place. The way to manage the time is to have a start and an end time for each item. And the responsibility for that rests with the actual agenda owner. And we'll come back to that later. And then having put together an agenda, there's the whole issue of communication. I'm seeing more and more examples of people saying, I didn't get the agenda, I didn't get the Zoom link, I didn't get the Teams meeting link. What's the password? Yeah, the two most common things now said in companies seem to be three is what's the link, what's the password, and you're on mute. So make sure that you've got an effective means of communicating. And again, communicate to everybody in a consistent way that they get used to. Make sure that you've put all the information people need in a place where they can access it. Again, that's the beauty of working virtually. There's the ability now to create shared access files, highly secure, often free, and if you're working in a large corporate, they're often part of your infrastructure anyway. So communicate what the agenda is, communicate what the pre-work is, communicate the importance of prompt attendance, and don't assume that people will remember. So set up in your email system an automated reminder, perhaps 2 days before or an hour before, whatever works for your organization. So avoid the stress of being uncertain about whether people will arrive on time and come well prepared. You can automate most of that quite effectively. So let's talk about the meeting itself. And again, we run a whole workshop on how to be professional in a virtual environment. I'm not going to rerun that. I'll just spend a couple of minutes on some of the highlights. We had a period, and it probably ran from early March through into May, June, during which there was a very high tolerance for anything happening on a virtual meeting. So it didn't matter what the background of behind your camera looked like. If you had a fridge in the back in your workshop, and you were squatted in the corner, everybody thought that was somewhat cute. There was also a fairly high tolerance for poor quality video, lighting, and audio. The simple reality is, while some of those things still apply, certainly some of the dress or grooming requirements seem to probably be with us. It's no longer appropriate, even if nice, to be formally dressed. So those things don't apply. But what we do know is unconsciously our brain does respond to what it observes. So our thinking brain may be tolerant, our thinking brain may dismiss things, but we know that unconsciously our brain accepts, values, and responds more positively to things that look and appear clear, well delivered, and professional. So you should definitely make sure, for example, and these are examples, if you're running a meeting, have everybody possible on camera. The only excuse should be that their bandwidth doesn't support it for your platform. Again, that shifts the level of attention up. Our research, if you remember, I said in a physical meeting, 50% of the time, people are attentive. If they're in a virtual meeting, it's about 33%. If the cameras are off, it drops to about 25. So if you've actually got 8 people in your meeting and all of you are off camera, the probability is that at any one point in time, only 2 people are attentive acutely to what you say. So get the cameras on. Make sure you've got reasonable lighting. Yeah, there's nothing worse than having camera and think about the camera angle. So again, you'll notice that I've tried to position that my face is just above halfway up. It's about 1/3 of the way down. I've got reasonable lighting. If we were using applications that actively support green screens, I can switch that on. That's not a requirement, simply because I don't want you to see what's behind that green screen. But I've got reasonable lighting, you can see me. So you get the feeling I'm in the room. Likewise, make sure that you have good sound. If you want to be heard, make sure your sound is clear. You don't want people doing this, trying to hear you. You equally don't want people doing that because you bellow. So think about, when you're running a meeting, how are you coming across in terms of visual and audio? You need to look professional. You need to sound professional. And that also goes for how you speak. Again, the sound, because of transmission, is compressed. So you need to be more articulate. You don't have to have some posh accent. You don't have to use posh language, but you do need to use some vocal variety, some changes in tone, some changes in volume, an occasional pause, which will get people's attention. So think about how you're going to come across, because you've got to replace all of that lost cognitive connection and that emotional distance that we talked about earlier. And that takes us then to managing the agenda. And by the way, all of that applies whether you're running the meeting, whether you're attending, and if other people are attending, you can offer advice. And then talking about managing to the agenda. So again, really important that you think about managing to the agenda. That means making sure that what's on the agenda is actually what happens. So a number of things that we need to think about in a virtual world, a number of things we need to consider. The first one is making sure that we have the platform open, ready for people to attend, that we have the backup channel if there are challenges. So in the event that we can't launch the platform that we've chosen, we have a quick and easy way of communicating to people what's happening and the alternative. Making sure that we start on time, but connect with people who join us early. So one of the things those of you who logged in early today will notice is I greeted you and connected you. Now, this is actually just a webinar, but if this was a meeting, we'd have probably engaged in some conversation. Why? Because I don't want you going off doing something else. Now you are connected. The login period is the period during which to get your attention on the meeting. That's why we scheduled it. So I don't want you connecting and then going off doing email, going off and getting coffee and so on. And then in terms of the timing on the agendas, if we've allocated time, so in this little example here, we can see that we've allocated from 9:05 till 9:30 to AN for a presentation of the results and a review of phase 1. Now, if we start to get to 9:20 and we sense, now AN should be doing this him or herself. If not, the timer should. If not, the person chairing the meeting should. As we get to, let's say, 20 minutes after 9, we should be pausing and saying, AN, are you going to achieve your outcome in the remaining 10 minutes? And the reason we should do that is AN has then got a choice. Are they going to find a new way to achieve the outcome? Are they going to achieve a smaller outcome and decide when and how they're going to complete it? Or are they going to do a trade with someone later in the agenda? Perhaps one of the later agenda points is critically important, but could be handled at a different time. But what we shouldn't allow is for the item from 9 till 9:30 to crash on till 9:40. That is unacceptable. It creates inefficiencies, and again, it drives bad decision making, because during the period of the overrun, we are all now conscious that we're overrunning, so we now cut corners. We do that unconsciously to try to recover. That means we make bad decisions on that agenda item. At the same time, the person coming after us is desperately now thinking about how they're going to recover, given that they've probably now got less time. And that means that their agenda item starts badly, and the unconscious mindset is we've got to catch up. That, again, unconsciously triggers bad decision making. Really critically important. This is not simply about, oh, yes, it's nice to stick to the timing, and, oh, Fred will be fine, he'll be quite happy. We now know from brain science and neuroscience that these things have a dramatic impact on the quality of the decisions that are made. So managing to the agenda is really important. That's why, going back to planning and preparation, especially in a virtual world, we need to be aware of our overconfidence bias and make sure we schedule enough time. There's then the issue about managing our presence. I run a program on impact virtually, and I talk about how do you make an impact in a virtual world, because suddenly being thrown into a work remotely or a WFM environment, we're now losing a lot of that physical contact. And that means that our impact across the organization has reduced. But equally, in virtual meetings, our impact has reduced. Again, remember, we used to be a physical body, X feet high, a meter wide. Now we are an inch square. Yeah, we used to have the rich tonality. We used to have the observation of our body posture, our facial expressions by other people in the room. A lot of that is now reduced. So we've got to make sure that we manage our presence. And one of the critical things is we've got to manage our presence in the sense that, are we paying attention? If we're attending a meeting which we should be at, either because it interests us or because we can influence it effectively, and preferably both, we need to be one of the 33% who are actually listening. So really important, think about the skills you've got. When you are actually on a virtual meeting, how do you keep your attention? Part of that, for example, is about where you look on the screen. Try to have a setup where your camera can be in eye line sight, as well as the pictures of the people that you're seeing or the slide deck. So that often means having a separate webcam that you can put on a tripod or something so that you can move its position. Likewise, get into the habit of consciously paying attention. And that can be as simple, for example, as having a little a timer beside you that flashes every so many seconds, every minute or every 20 seconds or 30 seconds. It can be as simple as getting into the habit of making notes. I have a lot of scrap paper which I use during meetings. And if I'm in a meeting that I know is important for me to be there, as the meeting transpires, I make lots of notes, the vast majority of which I will never look at again. That's why I use scrap paper. And at the end of the meeting, I throw them away. You say, well, why did you waste time writing them? I wasted time writing them because they kept my attention. I can't make notes about what you're saying unless I listen to you. Now, you might say, oh, that's silly. It's easy to listen. I'm telling you, yeah, we really, really don't listen for very much of the time. And you might want to do an experiment. Next time you're on a virtual meeting, if with the chairperson's permission, do the little research I did. And that is every now and then say, stop, write down what was just said. I bet you'll find it's about a third of the people are managing their presence. The other 2/3 are thinking about the shopping and what they're going to say next, etc. And then manage the airtime. When I went through the agenda, I was saying, think about during the agenda, when should we be starting? When should we be finishing? But it's also managing the airtime during the conversation. In all meetings, 80% of people will only make 20% of the contributions. That means 20% of the people suck the air out of the room. And I'm sorry to be brutal. And people often say, well, at the end of every agenda item, we always say, well, has anyone else got anything to add? Meaning that's the opportunity for the introverts to comment. Guess what? They don't. Yeah, very rarely. It's really important if you're bringing people together, and even more so in a virtual environment, People are hesitant to contribute very often in a face-to-face environment. You'll see these are the people who typically, if you're the chairperson in a physical meeting, they will often come and they sit at the back, and they very often sit at the back on your left as you look at them. Yeah, it's a phenomenon. It's a bit like if people go on a bus tour, they always, when they get back on the bus, always sit in the same seat. The same is true. People who are typically largely extrovert, who will talk a lot, if you're in a physical meeting, they will typically come and sit up near the front, and they'll often sit either to your right or on your right-hand side, where they can actually command the stage. It's really important, therefore, that in a meeting, if you've got limited time, you need to discipline the contributions. If people are sucking air out of the room, you need to limit that a little. And that's relatively easy to do. It's also important, though, that you pull other people in. Create safe space. And don't say, Fred, have you got anything to contribute? If Fred is an introvert, you've now just thrown a dagger at him. But what you could say is, Fred, I think you've got some interesting points from what I understand. And everyone, I'd like you to listen to Fred. Fred, just share your thoughts with us. I've now done two things to create that safe space. I've said, Fred, I believe your ideas are valuable. That's now given Fred confidence. And I've also said, shut up, everybody else. So Fred now knows that he's less likely to be interrupted or criticized. So think about, how are you going to manage the airtime? And again, you don't have to be the chairperson to do this. You don't have to be the facilitator. If you notice that someone is on a meeting and they are not contributing, you can make that interjection. Then there's something about managing attention and interest. If we know that without doing anything, the attention is going to be about 33%, and on a virtual meeting, that's what we should assume if the webcams are on, what can we do to increase that? And that's about using techniques to get people's attention and to get their interest. To get people's attention, again, the use of different vocal variety, suddenly changes in speed, sudden changes in volume, suddenly changing the visuals. You'll notice if you go, when this evening, perhaps when you go home, you may go to the pictures if you are allowed to. You're in an area where you can view a cinema, or you may watch the television. You'll notice that the televisions and most visual media now, they stimulate you approximately every 5 seconds. Why? Because they know your attention span is about twice that. They are maximizing the probability you stay with them. And films that you'll find you really like, you'll find stimulate you far more. And that's why we've seen the rapid explosion in the use of graphics, computer graphics, animations, and so on. Why? Because they stimulate us. So if you are making a talk at a meeting, if you are talking at a meeting, make sure that you are stimulating. You've got to keep people's attention. That means occasionally doing things which cause your video to change. If you're using slide decks, make them highly contrasted, make them very visual, and change them quickly. So if you're in a meeting where you want to have that engagement, you want to have that interaction, you've got to keep their attention. And you'll notice I'm just using the vocal variety today with a few examples here. You'll notice on this slide, the item I'm talking about, the contrast is much higher. I've dulled the others. Why? Because I want your attention on that item, not on the ones we've already covered. And think about using pauses. The pause in a virtual meeting is deafening. It brings people back to you. And then how do you get interest? Again, in physical meetings, there is something about the proximity. We are naturally tribal. So there is something about being together in a room that is bonding. People remember the people in the room. They remember the people who sat next to them. There is something very deep inside us that pulls us together and does tend to create some level of interest. Now, I've been in meetings, my level of interest died a rapid death fairly early on for a variety of other reasons. But generally, if you've picked your attendees well, they will start out with that level of interest. In a virtual world, that doesn't happen. Why? Because the people around them, if there are any, are not typically on the meeting. It's the partner, it's the children, it's the neighbors. In a virtual meeting, you've got to do more to try and keep people's interest, and a variety of techniques. Firstly, make sure you target your input at people. In any meeting, if there's 6 people, there's probably 2 at that point are your real targets. Call them out by name. That will get their attention, and they'll also be interested. Why did you call them out? So Fred, you're probably going to really enjoy this point when I cover it. We've got a lot of people on today. So Lyndon, I know that this is a topic you're really interested in. Or Anna, thanks for your input. I'm going to share something you said the other day with everybody now. And immediately, people perk up. It shuts off that unconscious brain, which was thinking about other things, pulls them back. And now, not only can they hear you, that's attention, but because they're now interested, they want to hear you. Likewise, during virtual meetings, try and keep teasing people. Keep reminding them of what we're trying to achieve. Keep reminding them of what we call the WIFM. What's in it for me? Keep reminding them of what the positive outcomes are. And likewise, give them a roadmap. So where are we going? If it's a long agenda, keep reminding them of the agenda. If it's a big agenda point, keep reminding of the steps in the agenda point that we're going to go through. And then lastly, follow up. I've mentioned already, think about minutes. It's absolutely critical in virtual meetings because of the questions around attention level. It's absolutely critical that following it, there is a document that records the actions agreed by whom, by when. Ideally, that should be in a shared environment, something like a Google Docs, your shared network files, your Teams meeting files, whatever. If not, then produce it as a document and email it. Have that done very rapidly. Minutes should go out in hours, not days. We want the record to go out while it's still clear, while people can still remember. If you write the minutes of a meeting the day after, you can guarantee there will be omissions, and if you'll have lost the sense and some of the detail. The other thing I'd strongly recommend is minute reports. For detailed operational meetings where there is an escalation process after it, you should also document, as I said, things that were considered and rejected, the reasons why things were chosen to make as recommendations. And we should always know when a meeting closes, how are we going to know that the things that have happened have happened? So whether it's minutes or a meeting report, we should know how will we, the attendees, know that the things people committed to actually happened. So a whole raft of material there. We're more than happy to engage with any of you to go into any of those points in more detail if they're of interest to you. As you've attended, we will be emailing out, as we always do. Most of you, I notice, are regular attendees, so thank you for coming back. Those of you who are new, welcome. We will be emailing you a copy of the slide deck. We will also be emailing you access to a recording. Because you've attended, we're also extending our usual monthly offer of a free 3-hour masterclass on making meetings, or in fact, any other of our topics if you're interested. So that offer will be in the email and the slide deck that we send you. This has been Making Virtual Meetings Matter. I'm Clinton Wingrove. I've been delighted to share this hour with you. If you've enjoyed what we've covered with you today, our next webinar will take place at the same time on November the 27th. And the subject is how to embed learning virtually. How to embed learning virtually. As we come out of the pandemic, excellence in management is going to be absolutely crucial for organizations to survive the exit from lockdown. So equipping managers to handle their own learning, equipping organizations to spread learning and embed it virtually is going to be a critical skill. We'll be sharing that on November the 27th at 2 p.m. Again, as you've attended, we will email you the link to register. For those of you, and I notice some of you are in the USA, for those of you in the USA, that will be Thanksgiving. This year will be the first year for 19 years, I believe, that I've not spent Thanksgiving in the US. I used to run a consultancy and software house out there. So enjoy your turkey or your vegan feast on Thanksgiving. But again, if you register, we will give you access after that webinar to the video recording. So that's an offer to our American colleagues. And by the way, good luck with your election this week, whichever way you swing on that. We hope that that goes smoothly with an effective result for you. So thank you, everyone. We're dead on time. That's exactly how it should be. I wish you stay safe, stay well.